Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first talk in our winter lunchtime lecture series on life and science, human lives in the history of the biosciences, both inside and outside of the lab. I'm Charlotte Abney Solomon, Assistant Director of the Beckman Center for the History of Chemistry and Kane Research Fellow at the Science History Institute. It's my honor today to introduce our speaker, Robin Wolf-Scheffler of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Before I do, though, I will say a bit about the format of today's lecture. First of all, today's lecture is being captioned, and you will find a link for the captioning in the comments. Robin will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, after which we will have 15 minutes for an audience Q&A. You can send in your questions during the talk using the chat function here on YouTube. You just need to log in, and we'll be collecting the questions from the chat for the speaker. You can also email us your questions at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. We do have a two-step spam filter, so if you're emailing us for the first time, you may need to watch your inbox and reply to a verification email. That's lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Robin Wolf-Scheffler is an associate professor in the program in Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. His first book, A Contagious Cause, The American Hunt for Cancer Viruses and the Rise of Molecular Medicine, addressed the growth of molecular biology and cancer research. He's currently working on a second book documenting the history of the biotechnology industry in Boston. Welcome, Robin. Thank you so much for joining us today to kick off the season.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here after that brief technical break. I'd like to thank Charlotte and Naomi Gonzalez and Vixen Cartwright for their organization logistics, especially in their efforts to make sure that this talk is being captioned in real time. Today, I'm going to talk with you about the role of humor in science. And in particular, I'm going to use a humor publication from a biochemistry lab in the 1920s, the Sir William Dunn Institute of Biochemistry at the University of Cambridge, which was one of the largest and most productive biochemistry laboratories of its time, to think about the role that humor plays in scientific research. But before I get to that question, and certainly as I started looking at the at brighter biochemistry years ago, I had to grapple with a more basic question, which is, does scientific humor even exist? And indeed, if you start reading about scientific humor, you may quickly become discouraged. One immunologist speaking to the American Philosophical Society in the mid-90s had to apologize that the title of his talk, Scientific Humor, appeared to be an oxymoron. Just the other year, one scientist wrote an editorial in Science magazine bemoaning the use of humor in scientific presentations, albeit in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. But more broadly, of course, it's hard to say if science can be humorous and if humor and science are compatible. If you think about many of the images that were given of scientists, we're sort of encouraged to place scientists in this sort of privileged moral category. They're seen as these virtuous truth seekers, like Aerosmith here. And it's hard to say precisely what's very funny about that. However, many more of you may already be thinking that that doesn't seem like the science you know. If you're a working scientist, if you know scientists, and frequently, if you speak with scientists, you find scientific humor everywhere. And it's not just a question of puns at protests. It's also sometimes in how things are named. So notoriously, Gary Larson of the Far Side made up a comic about calling the end of the Triceratops, what's called the pointy end, a thagomizer. And it's actually become called a thagomizer in the Smithsonian. There are institutional forms of humor, such as the Ig Nobel Prizes, sort of a parody of the Nobel Prizes. And then within the private correspondence of scientists, we often find humor if we look for it. Darwin, for example, is famous for having a long and bawdy exchange with the botanist J.D. Hooker regarding the length of the male reproductive member of the barnacles he was studying. Although if you look this up in the Charles Darwin papers, they don't necessarily call attention to that fact. At another level, there have been people in science and mathematics who have used humor and fun and play as a part of how they conduct their research and conduct their work. So, for example, Nicholas Bourbaki, who's purportedly the author of this textbook of elements, actually doesn't exist. But the Bourbaki group, which is a group of mathematicians in France and in Europe, will frequently issue publications for in his name. They had a whole mock wedding ceremony for his fictional daughter. And this is sort of an example of how fun and play and intellectual work can begin to commingle. And that's really what I'm interested in. And you see flashes of this in contemporary science all the time. So, for example, a few years ago, there was a hashtag for overly honest scientific methods. And although I hesitate to try to explain what makes things funny, this is a type of humor that draws on the juxtaposition of so these stock photos of scientists doing science with these very honest admissions that, we put our research sites in tropical locations because we wanted to go to nice places. The machines make scary noises, so we wanted to modify our procedures accordingly. And once again, in that type of ephemeral or sort of apparently jocular utterance, I actually see some very powerful clues for thinking about how scientists work and how science is made and done. But that, of course, brings me back to this very tricky question of what exactly is humor? And far better minds than I have tried and largely failed to provide a satisfying definition of this. And I'm not going to try to match their example today. Humor is something that is notoriously difficult to define. Some people say that they know it when they see it, but it's also notoriously hard to explain. There's no better way to remove the humor from a joke, for example, than to try to explain it to somebody else. But what I do want to highlight is that how we think about humor has large consequences for how we think about the nature of scientific humor. In particular, I want to sort of bring up two theorists of humor from the 20th century to sort of draw out this contrast: Sigmund Freud and the anthropologist Mary Douglas. Sigmund Freud exemplifies what one might call the individualistic approach to humor, which is the idea that what produces humor, what makes us laugh, is somehow the result more of an internal and individual psychic process. And in fact, here he's drawing on physiologists such as Herbert Spencer, who see the idea of humor as the release of something in many cases. And sort of theories of humor and what's funny can be framed in those individual terms. However, in the late 60s, Mary Douglas wrote an essay in the journal Mind called "The Social Control of Cognition, Some Factors in Joke Perception," in which she suggests a very different interpretation of humor, and one that I've found very helpful to think about, which is that humor is actually always about a group. It's always about a society. You can't have humor on an individual basis. And moreover, what Douglas suggests is that humor is something that can be very stabilizing. And instead of being something that is disruptive or innocuous, humor can be part of what binds us together as a social group, and it can help promote social cohesion and stability, even if it appears to be very disruptive on the surface. And a number of people working in anthropology and sociology following Mary Douglas have started to suggest that not only is humor a conservative and stabilizing force in stressful situations, it's also a way of building community when there's few other ways of building a community. And that's the spirit in which I'm going to take us into looking at a particular case of this type of scientific humor, which is brighter biochemistry at the Sir William Dunn Institute of Biochemistry. For its time, the Sir William Dunn Institute of Biochemistry was a was a big science effort. It was established. The Cambridge Biochemistry Department in 1919 received the single largest private donation to any scientific department in England from Sir William Dunn, who had been a trader and merchant and was very interested in biochemistry. He was drawn to Cambridge by the fame of Frederick Rowland Hopkins, a biochemist who wins the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamins. And the laboratory grows incredibly rapidly. By the mid-1920s, it has 50 to 60 members, which makes it the largest laboratory in Cambridge, which is much larger, for example, even than the famous Cavendish Physics Laboratory at the same time. So biochemistry in Cambridge between the Second and First World Wars is a big, famous, rich scientific community. And this new building pictured here was the instantiation of that community, and also Hopkins' vision for what has been called dynamic biochemistry. Biochemistry as a new, vibrant, and independent discipline, separate and independent from physiology, chemistry, and medicine. And the building gave this form. And of course, you can see Brighter Biochemistry features the cover of the entrance to that building on its cover. So the building, the community of biochemists at Cambridge, and this publication were deeply intertwined with each other from the beginning. However, it's one thing to talk about doing biochemistry, but it's quite another thing to actually do the work of doing biochemistry. Biochemistry involves many experimental procedures that take hours to complete, overnight experiments. There were floods when people left equipment unattended. It also required these long periods of time where people would work in new and flexible collaborations. Given that biochemistry, as Hopkins envisioned it, was interdisciplinary, people had to form many more of what are sort of considered horizontal working alliances rather than the vertical working alliances that characterized established scientific disciplines. So this means that working actually in biochemistry in Cambridge in the 1920s is a very undefined and amorphous process. And into this, you can also throw the fact that due to Hopkins' views on coeducation, which he was strongly in favor of, it was also one of the first mixed gender scientific social spaces in which men and women met each other on equal terms. And this led to a considerable amount of winking and nodding, but it also had some very serious implications for how to organize social groups, which had previously relied on, say, masculine norms of authority. What does it mean, for example, for a bacteriologist such as Marjorie Stevenson to be the senior member of a scientific collaboration directing people, but also for many of the younger scientists who are entering biochemistry in Cambridge, such as Joseph Needham, the mixed gender space compared to the gender segregated Cambridge colleges contains its own appeal. And the laboratory quickly earned the epithet Hoppy's dating agency. But you can already see here the mixture of the of humor and science. So this poem quoted here is from one of Hopkins' contributions to Brighter Biochemistry. A and B, that's he and she, toiled hard and toiled quite separately. These things must be a sort of biochemistry. When bonds are free, affinity works, it's inevitable decree. But if you please, dear A's and B's, don't all seek out affinities. And then that gets laundered into this explanatory cartoon for thermodynamics, which is the sort of the impossibility of the impossibility of reversing entropy. And you can see here that the demon in the center despairs of actually separating the A and B particles, the men and women of the laboratory. So the Dunn Institute is really of an extraordinary scientific and social space. And despite its prestige and fame, there's a lot of undefined questions about what its day-to-day working routines will look like. And once again, that's where I think something like Brighter Biochemistry gives us a lot of insight actually into how this community was formed and how it works. And I'm going to do that for the rest of this talk in sort of three broad parts. The first part, I'm going to sort of talk a bit more about the form of Brighter Biochemistry. I'm then going to talk about some of the internal stabilizing satire, and then I'm going to think of some of the more aggressive ridicule that helped define the boundaries of the community. And that's where the humor gets a bit more dark and a bit more savage. And then I'll sort of come out and reflect on what this might make us think about humor in science overall. So there's a few big traditions that Brighter Biochemistry as a publication draws upon as its members are beginning to publish it in 1923. The first is a long-standing tradition of holiday dinners that scientific departments would hold. These are typically very alcohol-fueled. There's a lot of bawdy humor, and they're typically sort of borrowed from the fraternal societies and eating clubs, which were popular in cities such as London. One visiting Russian physicist, Pyotr Kapisa, described another dinner at the Cavendish Laboratory in the 1920 as we all ate and drank. Between toasts, songs from a collection written by the physicists themselves were sung. The lab, physics, and the professors were all serenaded in comical terms. You could do anything you liked at the table, yell, squeal, and so on. But also interestingly, Kapisa reported that there were no ladies present at the dinner. So this is very much a masculine tradition of holiday scientific dinners in various forms. It still continues. This is the University of College of London Ramsay Society dinner from a few years ago. You can see the wine glasses prominently displayed, and elements of brighter biochemistry, such as including holiday greetings in the various issues, and there were 8 of those issues from 1923 to 1931, testified to its associations with sort of these holiday humorous celebrations. However, there's also a lot of other influences. In particular, brighter biochemistry, unlike, say, the songbooks that many other departments produce, contains new material, and it contains a mixture of words, poems, illustrations, comics, and in that sense, the most direct antecedent is a magazine such as Punch, which was sort of a paragon of British middle-class satire, combining really a lot of different genres of humor and representation. So it's not just songs, it's not just cartoons, it's not just essays. Each issue presents a mixture of those. And the final tradition, which I want to highlight, is the sort of yearbook quality of this. So that's the annual nature of the publication memorializes events that happen in the laboratory. And there's also a new set of editors every year. And indeed, the act of editing appears to be a way of bringing new people into the lab. And so in my effort to identify the editors, which is actually quite difficult because the contributions are only signed with initials. So it sort of promotes, once again, that sense of a collective production of the lab. Nonetheless, the editors do appear to be the more junior members. They appear to be younger in the laboratory. So Hopkins is not editing the journal, and they also tend to be from groups that are previously sort of not well represented in sort of elite Cambridge high science, especially women. Hopkins did approve of this venture. He contributed the opening contribution to, I think, every single issue. And as he spoke of another undergraduate medical publication, I think he saw it as a means of awakening in those who have chosen their career a sense of comradeship, an early sense of their community of interests, and it links them together for those who are entering upon a great and difficult calling. One of the challenging questions that I've grappled with is how funny was it really? Because honestly, when I read brighter biochemistry, I still have difficulty finding it funny. And that's a challenge. I think that speaks to the distance of time and space. And I apparently wasn't the only one. The publication sort of is largely focused in Cambridge, but it also gets reviewed by journals such as The Lancet, which warned that most of the humor is local and there's an excess of it. But anyone who has a moderate knowledge of biochemistry and a sense of humor should enjoy it immensely. And before moving to the particular contributions that we're supposed to enjoy, I do want to highlight that this is not simply something that scientists did for fun. By the middle and end of the 1920s, many people in the laboratory were complaining they were simply too busy to complete it, and they had a laboratory-wide meeting in which they decided that it had to be revived. And as one contribution stated after that moment of sort of near death of the publication, it was important because there was a brighter biochemistry, but there was no gayer geology, funnier physics, cheerier chemistry, sillier psychology, merrier mineralogy, artier anatomy, happier agriculture, prettier parasitology, better botany, or singular zoology. So in that sense, they see the production of this as a really defining feature of their community at the Dunn Institute of Biochemistry. And that brings me into what types of humor are present and what we can maybe learn about the Dunn that we couldn't learn from the other historical sources that are available to us. So the first is the question of how humor can stabilize sort of new communities, and I'm going to call this punching up humor. And this type of humor is very much rooted in sort of traditions of satire. And satire is something that people talk about in a lot of other settings, and it's an odd form of humor because it appears to be very critical, but it actually can be very conservative. And sort of a touch point for thinking about this is the idea of carnival. And carnival, of course, in sort of the Catholic European tradition, is a time when all the normal rules of society are suspended. There's these inversion. Heaven is traded for hell. You can see this detail here with sort of the battle between Lent on the right and the meat pie wearing embodiment of carnival on the left. But paradoxically, as anthropologists have noted, that these types of rituals end up affirming the basic rules of society that were supposed to be suspended. And you actually see a lot of carnival-esque rituals. The dinners that I referred to earlier would fit into that category. Genentech, the biotech company, had a series of ho-hos in which the CEOs would dress up in odd costumes. And you see this type of humor very commonly in brighter biochemistry. So, for example, Sir Frederick Golan Hopkins, who's sort of the paragon of leadership of the laboratory, is presented in one way in this official portrait, but then in a number of other comical ways. So when he was knighted, he appears as a knight with a wordplay banner, which is glutathione, which is a play on glutathione, which is an enzyme that he studied in the 1920s. There's a seal that involves him riding a mouse. He's depicted as King Frederikus in another example in which he exclaims, "Alack, my knowledge of the current literature is woefully behind." So those are some of those basic parodies. And importantly here, it's having the opportunity to sort of vent some steam at the boss allows the rest of the laboratory to function more smoothly. Another way that this type of satire can work is actually by being pedagogical, by teaching people about history, even as it claims to mock it. And for those of you who are familiar with 1066 and all that, which is sort of an offhand rendition of British history that came out in the 1930s, it's a similar spirit. So Hopkins, in his desire to sort of build the discipline of biochemistry, put these, I've framed one of them, has four sort of important figures in the prehistory of biochemistry carved into the substance of the biochemistry library within the Institute. But contributions to brighter biochemistry take a very different tone towards that sort of sense of history. For example, one contribution offers the Wind Whistle Institute of Fundamental Research, which claims that if it is the case that in these stories of people surviving after persevering against long odds, sort of these self-made scientist stories, then really the most prestigious laboratory should be down in the basement, and the laboratories for the least talented people should be sort of the luxurious, well-staffed laboratories. So a classic type of inversion. This type of satire also provides a way for talking about a lot of dissatisfaction. And above all, the Dunn is a scientific workplace. And if you may know from other places, like lab work is hard. It can be stressful. There's a lot of questions about it. And so the brightness of biochemistry is one very prominent way of dealing with it. As this cartoon, the biological outlook, sort of somebody is imprisoned, peeking out the window. And this idea of brightness and being productive intellectually are really very closely yoked together in the types of humor and the types of self-presentation that people in brighter biochemistry offer. So Hopkins, for example, describes the Dunn in one contribution as a mysterious universe drawing energy from rays supplied by the Medical Research Council, charitable fellowships in the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, and its luminous stars, the researchers, emit BJ, which are biochemical journal waves. But this highlights the fact that most of the funding on the laboratory, due to, in part, Hopkins sort of difficulty managing the finances of the Institute, was fairly precarious, and people were sort of going from year to year, not quite knowing where their next fellowship would come from. And Hopkins encouraged them, be bright no matter what befall, in spite of every departmental jag. When your work inclines to lag, looms overlarge, to ease your pain, read biochemistry again, and say all day and night, I will be bright, I will be bright. So brightness in this sense is a way of responding to a great deal, conceals and sort of responds to a great deal of potentially adversity and frustration. And here, actually, the brightness that's being referred to is very closely modeled on the bright young things of sort of London in the Jazz age. And suggestively, the bright young things are famous for having their own their own sort of set of inside jokes, for their sort of scandalous antics at parties, but also for, in their own genteel way, being perpetually at risk of poverty. And the reason that I want to especially highlight this is that it's one of the few places that we have a history of how women felt about their position in the Dunn. And if you look at this contribution that an anonymous contributor provided of the Biofemina, this is sort of a dress form model, and you can see that it says many of the same bodily features of sort of a jazz age flapper, and she's in the process of conducting an experiment. But if you look more closely, she's wearing a burlap sack dress. Tate is a sugar company. And this cuts to the core of what Marjorie Stevenson and Dorothy Needham, who are two of the women members of the laboratory who went on to become fellows of the Royal Society, described as sort of the persistent poverty and uncertainty that many of the women working in the laboratory felt, because they were still, although equal in the laboratory, unequal within the structure of Cambridge University. They had very little access to institutional funding, which really meant every single year in Dorothy Needham's recollection that she existed on a melange of temporary grants from one research grant to another, devoid of position, rank, or emolument. So this is both notable for drawing attention to the poverty that these women faced. It's also very notable for being an exercise of humor about women in science at a time when women were still being kicked out of medical colleges on the grounds that the humor of scientists and doctors made them coarse, immodest, and vulgar. But nonetheless, we can ask ourselves, do these types of protests really challenge those gender dynamics, or do they provide, once again, a way of sort of acknowledging them without actually having to change them very much? So that's exactly sort of one of the questions that satire raises. And to wrap up, I want to turn to this question of what I'll call punching out, which is there's one type of humor that sort of by punching up at the leadership can be seen as stabilizing, but there's a much more coarser and sort of harder humor, which is directed at defining what biochemistry is and makes use of a much sort of more challenging set of tools for a historian of science to think about. And it comes back to this question of what type of a science is biochemistry supposed to be? And people in the Dunn were very much trying to establish themselves as sort of in the tradition of physics, of being a pure science, sort of concerned with the advancement of knowledge rather than application. But this was frequently challenged by the fact that many people thought biochemistry should be applied to problems of medicine, to problems of nutrition. And so humor is a way of trying to define who a biochemist should be and what they should aspire to. And you can see that in jocular forms. So that, for example, there's a universal testimonial form, which one person puts out, which is a form recommendation. I haven't reproduced all of it here, but you can see the play with gender on the upper right-hand corner, where it's a recommendation for he, she, or it. And all of these other categories, accusing them of drinking too much during their exams. But the final conclusion is always that the person is interested in science for its own sake. And this is precisely the type of thing that the fame of the Dunn can challenge. In particular, many members of the Dunn felt extremely uneasy about their status as objects of curiosity. People would come to visit the Dunn as a famous scientific laboratory, and they frequently expressed their dissent in racial terminology. So there's a few examples of people writing in to ask about nutrition using a type of stereotypical sort of Chinese English that I'm not going to quote here. You also have examples like Hopkins' Showman's Apology, in which he discusses his unease here at escorting a series of visitors from Japan through the laboratory and exposing such gentle creatures as work within to the so-called Asiatic gaze. And so, of course, there's many visitors to the Dunn that are not from Japan, but sort of that orientalizing that visit is a very suggestive element of how sort of the difference between appropriate science and sort of and the inside and outside of the Dunn are established. This type of work also carries over to ridiculing people who don't understand the nature of biochemistry. And so there's a lot of political wordplay. And I think this is interesting here, both for sort of showing the politics. There's a pointed reminder that the people who are not misunderstanding biochemistry will also set the budgets for research, but also there's an effort to sort of co-opt and take the intellectual or sort of cultural status of politics because of being sort of fluent in the arts and the classics, by saying that biochemists and scientists can also claim that type of work through the wordplay with science. So sort of I can do your thing and my thing as an effort to sort of capture the prestige of both and do it in a fairly public way. So these are all ways that sort of the humor in the Dunn is also used to exclude and minimize people who are seen as being inappropriate members. And so that's, once again, the humor both can both sort of stabilize and define. However, it's also a challenge for us to know how to find this, because very often the historical record wants us to think that humor is simply a fun and sort of ephemeral thing. And this is sort of even in how the biochemistry laboratory is memorialized in a series of sort of volumes honoring Hopkins after his death. We see the humor reproduced only to highlight sort of the enjoyable or the funny or the sort of lively elements of it, as opposed to also focusing on the parts of brighter biochemistry that draw attention to the conflict, the concern, the stress that also went along with doing science. And so I think that because humor is, in the words of the Lancet, so local, it's hard to generalize about scientific humor. But I think that my experience of sort of working with brighter biochemistry has made me convinced that humor is really a very serious part of modern science. And if we're looking at how modern science actually works, how people work together, how they collaborate, how they put in the long hours necessary to sort of produce the papers and discoveries that we typically associate with science, we also need to be looking at humor as a way in which they make sense of their work and their lives as scientists. And now I'll be very happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I want to let everybody in the audience know, if you weren't here for the beginning, if you have any questions for Robin, you can leave it in the chat. We'll have them right here. Or you can also email us at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. All right, so we already have a question for you in the chat, Robin. One that might be a little provocative, actually. Tom Tritton asked, since you and others don't find brighter biochemistry to be very funny, are you looking for other, perhaps more contemporary sources that are actually humorous?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I spent a lot of time sort of wondering what I gotten myself into. And I think that one of the challenges of humor is exactly that it's very hard to find jokes that travel across many different communities. And so things that are considered very funny in one place often fall flat in another. And I think that's an experience that we've all had. And that's exactly one of the reasons I think humor is such an interesting thing to think about, is because it sort of exists in a time and a place and a community, and it doesn't travel especially well. So that's why I moved away from trying to demonstrate that brighter biochemistry is funny. If you do think it's funny, that's great. But I don't think that it has to be funny. But scientific humor doesn't have to be funny to be interesting, if you will.
All right. Julia Sable has a couple of comments maybe you could say a little bit more about. Says, I am most interested in the value of humor for communicating science to the public and using humor to humanize scientists in the public's eye.
Yeah, I think that's I think that certainly one of the things I would say is that, I don't think science has any more or less humor than other communities. I do think, once again, that because humor can be so specific, how you use it is very much about who you're communicating with. And so jokes that seem very funny in one context or might be very provocative fall flat. And I think that we see that all the time. I mean, there's any number of examples from sort of contemporary discourse about, is this a funny joke? Is it going to be a compelling joke for sort of convincing the audience that I have? And certainly, like, questions of science communication hinge on this. And I think, humor can be a part of that, but it needs to be used judiciously.
All right. Our director of the Beckman Center here, Daniel John Mitchell, has a question. He says, the community humor at the Dunn seems to contrast with James Clerk Maxwell's private, i.e. shared between friends, humor, as expressed in his poetry. Maxwell being, of course, the first director of the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge. Do you have any comments on this comparison?
I think that's a really interesting observation. And that's why I think thinking about the form as well as the content of humor has been so helpful for me, is certain types of humor are more private. There is a difference between a joke that you share with a colleague versus deciding to put together a journal that is not only shared among the entire laboratory, but also sold to undergraduates and use to broadcast, this is what your laboratory is about. And so the fact that the Brighter Biochemistry was something that was very explicitly designed to be an outward sign of the laboratory's identity is what made me think it was such a interesting thing to look at to learn more about biochemistry in Cambridge as a whole.
Catherine Stanley asks, do you think that we could use humor to draw more people into the discipline of biochemistry or other sciences, and if so, how?
I think that we should certainly shy away from the assumption that, excuse me, science isn't funny or that science is serious. I think those are sort of stereotypes of science that most of the working scientists I know would put aside. I think that it's very important to sort of talk with people about what makes science enjoyable, rewarding as a career, but also, and this might be a place where humor is important, how you have to deal with setbacks and frustrations. And so those are all ways that I think humor could be helpful. But I also, once again, want to offer the caution that humor has this double-edged, at least nature. It can be something which is sort of playful, but it can also very quickly turn mean and nasty and sort of draw in other social, it can draw on it can draw on as racism as we saw in the Dunn. It can draw on gender stereotypes in a way that could very quickly become seen as quite exclusionary to people. So jokes are always about sort of drawing a boundary between inside and outside, and sometimes that boundary can leave people out.
I actually have a follow-up question to that. I was wondering about in the third example in your talk, in the third section, you were talking about that boundary drawing, and I was wondering whether you saw as much boundary drawing inside the lab. Do those boundaries run inside the lab, or do the jokes in Brighter Biochemistry specifically tend to draw a line around the community as who is not currently in it and doesn't belong, or do they tend to have people inside the lab as the butt of jokes, kind of signaling that people that are currently in the lab don't belong?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly why understanding all the ways that humor works is so helpful for me, because you see a lot of jokes about people in the lab, but they tend to be in that punching up tradition. And so they're the type of jokes that sort of allow people to like grouse a bit that so-and-so like didn't do something they promised, or it is a way for someone who's coming into the laboratory to understand like, oh, this is how the lab is structured. Like you've got Hopkins on the top and you've got these other people in the hierarchy. And those are the people who often appear for sort of friendly satire. Whereas the things on the outside, politicians, people who want more research in applied sciences, such as nutrition, visitors who aren't scientific at all, those are the people who sort of get taken in for this more harsher forms of humor, not satire, but like blunt ridicule, using racial caricature, things like that, which are very much about that line. So that's exactly sort of one of the reasons that Brighter Biochemistry is so fascinating, is it shows all these different ways that humor functions in a scientific workplace.
A lot of different directions.
Yeah.
Julia Sable has a follow-up question. Says, I would like to ask Dr. Scheffler and the people viewing this webinar for examples where humor helps the public pay attention to and understand scientific research.
Oh, that's a good one. I think, well, honestly, I think that XKCD in the present is doing a lot of really interesting stuff. I know that I've seen people circulating Randall Scott's mRNA vaccine explainer within sort of the virology community as a great example of like using Star Wars to explain how mRNA vaccines work. So that's certainly one place that I've seen it in at present. But if other people have things they'd like to offer, I'll leave the floor open for that.
All right. If anyone out there has any other examples, feel free to leave them in the chat as well. She says that's a great example. So I have another question. So I was immediately thinking when you showed the example of the Twitter meme of overly honest research methods, about how humor can provide an outlet for scientists to talk honestly about limitations and just choices, choices in the agency of the scientists themselves in the research, changing things or choosing things that do actually affect the outcome, that affect the data that you collect, affect the research that you're able to publish, such as how do we choose our subjects? Where do we choose it? Like, how do we choose our locations? how might you account for the discrepancy and like, oh, all of this research is done in tropical locations. I wonder why that is. And even just down to choosing the speed at which you spin the sample. These seem like things that in the publication of the research might be papered over or defended or justified in some way that really humor might be the only outlet for honesty about that. Do you think that this is something that carries on back through something, a venue like Brighter Biochemistry, or is this more, do you find it newer?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to Daniel Mitchell's question about sort of private versus sort of public forms of humor. And the interesting thing to me is that, you know, humor has its forms and genres, but also scientific publication and scientific communication also have their own sort of written and unwritten rules about what you're supposed to say. And a perfect example of that is how quickly you lose your methods section as you sort of compress and condense a paper for publication. And as anyone who sort of works with scientists knows, you'll hear them immediately grousing when they're not in their paper about, oh, like this sample was hard to set up, or you know, the euphemism of floor extraction for picking something that you dropped off the floor in chemistry. So those are all, so exactly, there's this whole, what another sociologist, Irving Goffman, would call the backstage to doing science that frequently when it's being presented to the public or even to other scientists is lost out. And historians of science are very interested in that backstage. And so I think absolutely that humor is one of the ways of revealing that. And you see many instances in Brighter Biochemistry of people sort of talking about difficulties getting to the storeroom, sort of how they're staying up all night working, and so all these various elements that are definitely a part of doing the biochemistry they're doing, but would never make it into the biochemical journal, for example.
All right, fantastic. Well, I really appreciate that. That really encapsulates why this talk is a great start for this series, where we're really trying to get into the human lives behind the biosciences and these very human aspects of the science that kind of get hidden in the course of the publication and the establishment of these scientific results that there are. Humor is just such a great way of getting at the openness about them that you wouldn't find someplace else.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, if I may, I think we have one last question that came in.
You are correct, we do. Ruth Rand, one of our postdoc fellows here, says, we've discussed the complexity of defining something as specific and context-bound as humor. From a methodological perspective, how do you use humorous texts as sources?
Yeah, and I think that if I can, I'll use one final metaphor. I really see them as doorways. I think that there's a line from the historian Robert Darnton, which is like the past is a foreign country, and you can learn a lot about it. You can learn a lot about a country by trying to understand its humor. And if you get to a point where you can at least understand why something might be funny, I think you've learned a lot about that community, about that place and time. And so when I'm encountering humorous texts like Brighter Biochemistry, I think they're invitations to try to learn more about the people and places that produce them, as opposed to simply saying, oh, they were doing it for fun, or they weren't being serious, or it's just a joke. I think it's quite serious.
Fantastic. All right, I think we will wrap up here. Thank you so much, Robin. Fantastic talk. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks to all of you for tuning in.
All right, this talk has been the first of 6 in this winter series, streaming every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. The second talk in our series promises to touch on what Robin just referred to as the masculine norms of authority in biology labs. Jenna Tan of Boston College will be giving a talk entitled The Evolutionary Brotherhood, Manliness, and Experimental Zoology in 19th Century America. Please join us for that next Wednesday, February 24th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. For more from the Science History Institute, including updates on all of our virtual programs and events, you can follow us online. We are at scihistory.org on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next week.